Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Grace Law, and I'm chair of the Department of Architecture here at the GSD. Andrew Holder and I have devised the idea of positions as a series of conversations convened by our department aimed at revealing the positions taken by players on the field of contemporary architecture. The series hopes to unfold the complexity of relations and metaphors and make them explicit for all of you, inviting, again, faculty and guests to voice where they stand. So today we're delighted to welcome Jing Liu and Amin Taha. And I'm just going to briefly, many of you know them because they're teaching here now, but I will just give you a brief sense of their backgrounds. After receiving her education in China, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States, Jing Liu co-founded VIII with Florian Eidenberg in 2008 in New York City. Jing is teaching an option studio here entitled The Coming Community that involves intervention in museum culture. Through building practice and interdisciplinary collaborations, Jing has led VIII to explore new fabrication techniques such as the Kuka Gallery, Las Americas Housing Project, and K11 Museum, and to engage with socio-political conditions of contemporary cities. And these are in projects like the Martin Luther King Library in Cleveland, Neighborhoods Now initiative in New York, and the Melbourne Arts Precinct Transformation. In these projects, Jing considers the feedback loop between the cultural, social, economic, and political systems unique to the place and its material practices, and to make positive contributions toward transformation. As a past and present board member of several nonprofit institutions, including the Van Allen Institute and Urban Design Forum, Jing furthers these endeavors in the broader public sphere. Jing has written a number of publications on numerous topics, including housing, design culture, and female practices. She's contributed to numerous publications, including Solid Objectives, Order, Edge, and Aura, and Home Futures, Living in Yesterday's Tomorrow. Jing has been a faculty member at Columbia GSAP and at the Pratt Institute, as well as at Princeton, UT Austin, Hong Kong University, and many other esteemed institutions. Jing received the VIII Prize for her contribution to American society, the United States Artist Fellow, the American Academy of Arts and Letters Award in Architecture, and was named the New Generation Leader of Women in Architecture Awards. So thank you for joining us. Amin Taha is chairperson and founder of Group Work, a London-based employee ownership trust of architects and landscape architects focused on tectonic assembly and low-embodied carbon materials. Incorporating the practice, which he founded actually in 2001, while still working with Zaha Hadid and Muff Architecture, he incorporated that practice in 2003 with two partners originally. And Amin is currently co-teaching a studio with Hanif Kara entitled Magna Parens Materia that investigates the material, tactile, and textural properties of stone at the intersection of structural, financial, and carbon cost. In 2017, Amin's practice built his home and office at 15 Clerkenwell Close with its distinctive structural exoskeleton fabricated from raw limestone. The building was immediately fascinating as it was reported to have diminished its CO2 emission by 92% when steel and concrete were substituted with stone. And it became carbon negative where aluminum partitions, plaster, and paint were replaced with timber studs and veneer, plywood, and MDF. This was a very controversial building, you might have recalled, which was saved from demolition in 2019 and made a finalist of the Sterling Prize in 2021. Group Work has completed several other projects that have been put forward for the by RIBA for the Sterling Prize and the EU Mies Prize for Best Building of the Year. The practice Group Work has also won various architectural competitions ranging from private houses through metro stations, infrastructure, and master planning. Amin is a lecturer at the Royal College of Art London and the 2024 Architectural Association Ljubljana elective. He was elected as a trustee at the Sir John Soane Museum in 2021, where he also chairs the annual Soane Medal for an Architect's or Historian's Contribution to Architecture. Please join me in welcoming Jing and Amin. Thank you so much.
thanks for that introduction. You can see why we give you one-liners, can't you? It's sort of excruciating listening to that, but thank you. Where do I start? Okay, so...
You start.
Yeah. All of you will graduate at some point, as we did, and possibly work for all sorts. This is me graduating, working in various offices, and I think my last job, proper job, was with Zaha, working on Maxi and various other projects. I mean, Hanif is not here, but Hanif's practice was with the engineers on these, so we sort of established an early relationship, and also, I guess, understanding how architects and engineers can or should be integral. So these are fairly straightforward structures. What you see is what you get. The concrete is essentially the superstructure and the form of the building. A change did occur, and I suspect it's still prevalent, where our form-making abilities in the software, dare I say, went beyond understanding what the structure was, or is, or should be. Engineering-wise, those relationships in some respects divorced. So we had the ability of engineers to effectively tell us whatever you design, whatever form you design, we can make it work, we can make it stand up. I don't want to say I found it intriguing. I found it, dare I say, the beginning of a slightly problematic, in that we could achieve pretty much anything we drew. It didn't matter exactly what it did, and you would find, if Hanif was here, I would tease him about it, because you can see on the next slide, we would create these fantastic structures, and sometime down the line would come superstructure and substructure that would then hold up the external internal skins. By that stage, it was already too late to integrate superstructure. So you can see there, the superstructure is actually quite fascinating, but the skin has absolutely no relationship with that superstructure. In fact, a giant piece of substructure is already strapped onto the outside and the inside to hold up a skin that was never imagined as being part of that structure. All well and good. You sort of scratch your head, you think, well, that's the future. It's all possible. Hooray. And you begin to realize, well, I suppose that's pretty much everything. That's how we build today. Whatever form we create, even if they're meant to have a sort of historical illusion, ultimately they are skins that are suspended from superstructure. Various offices I had worked in when I graduated also did this sort of work, and London is full of this sort of thing. So allusions to the past, where there's a complete lack of knowledge lack of knowledge, forgetfulness. I'm not even sure if we were ever knew the information to forget of why those forms existed in the first place. So the idea of that tectonics driving the form. So these are meant to allude to Victorian and Georgian, what we call warehouses in quotation marks, really just sort of clerks' offices, where the brick and the stone, any cast iron, the performance of that structure would have driven the size of those lintels, the spans, and therefore the form of those buildings. But now they are just drawings. They are drawings that somehow are meant to represent or allude to the past. And as an architect, we make beautiful drawings. They're effectively wallpaper. And some of our students will know I constantly criticize our profession as being highly indebted wallpaper artists. I've spent too many years in that training without understanding what that structure is behind it. We create beautiful drawings, and they're suspended from structure. And you can ask yourself, does it really matter? What's the problem, I mean? Certainly this sort of thing. This is bits of brick that have been plastered along, so you see from that previous slide, while 100 years ago, simply brick and stone would have held up that entire building. We're now creating superstructures in either steel or concrete and having to bring the brick from top down to the bottom. Sounds really prosaic, but this is ultimately where I'm heading, where I'm about to pause, and that we've forgotten that these bricks can hold up the entire form, as it were, the entire structure. And this is the origins of all architecture, the tectonics, the materials that architecture is made of, the stuff that we apparently draw beautifully but forget has mass and weight and structural ability, let alone its poetic outcomes. And then these sort of things happen where balconies, where the edge, the slab of the balcony has been actually plastered with bricks, handed over to a subcontractor to build because the architect's drawn it beautifully, got it through approvals, and then the subcontractors ultimately put it together in a manner that's clearly going to collapse and injure somebody. And obviously we have all sorts of other outcomes in the UK. So it begins to suggest ethical outcomes. You begin to question, what does it matter? Who cares how it's built? Ultimately, it looks beautiful, it's got those approvals, everyone's happy with it, the townscape looks pretty, but are there any ethical outcomes to this? So you'll know that Richard Sennett was taught by Hannah Arendt, and the difference between the two is ultimately that Richard Sennett believes that your ethical purpose is in your making, your skill, your abilities as specifically architects for us, that you'll be highly skilled, but ultimately you still have ethical purpose. You should have ethical purpose. To what end, otherwise, is this training? Is this skill development? Ethics are laws. We negotiate them between us and turn them into laws. And some of them are legislated and some of them are not. They're fairly straightforward. Structural integrity, fire safety, so on and so forth. And of course, most urgently today, embodied carbon. The appearance, the style, is one of the least of it, because we do not have necessarily any ethical reason to challenge or negotiate with one ourselves about how we dress, how we look, what our haircuts are, and so on and so forth. So it's the last thing of all the priorities we should be negotiating. I think that's the end of my section.
Great. Actually, a lot of the question you're asking were exactly the question that I was going to put out as the paving the way for the talk. And I thank you, Grace and Andrew, actually, to organize this, because it's been 15 years since we started our office in 2008, and it's a rare moment to kind of look back at the beginning. And I was just telling Matt earlier, or Grace earlier, that some of the slides for the project that I'm going to show doesn't even exist in the current format that our Google slides have anymore. So I had to actually reconvert the old PowerPoint to extract those images. So it's quite rare to go down the memory lane, but also look at the medium and the history of medium that has transformed so vastly in the last 15 years. So I want to start by explaining this name of our office. And this is something that I haven't explained for a long time, because for a while I thought that it's better to just leave it ambiguous. But in the beginning, we were asked quite a bit of what does soil mean, because it looks like it means something. So it actually stands for solid objectives, Edinburgh-Liu. We were at the moment thinking, at that moment, 2008, thinking, should the office be standing for some kind of agenda for the future, or should it admit to ourselves that this is just collaboration or endeavor or inquiry of individuals through the passage of time, knowing that we are always going to evolve together with the time. The gender will evolve and transform over time. So rather than solidifying, that one agenda at that moment and letting kind of the personhood to be the core of that practice, we couldn't decide which one is the way to go. So we just put the two together. And obviously it also becomes a word that can stand on itself, that means something material. But it also alluded to Brooklyn, where we started our practice. If you pronounce it so ill, then it makes a lot of sense. And we started in 2008, and this was just a moment as good as any other moment. Some of you probably still remember the crash that happened, and it was also very much a moment where social network was starting to really take hold, and conditions and inform the way that we connected with each other. This is there are many images like this. The kind of sheer shock that the world was experiencing at that moment in 2008. We all grew up in the 80s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. This one directional movement towards globalization, towards the world becoming one through all these institutions and through this mechanism was seemingly the only way the passage of time was going. And then 2008 was, I think a lot of people felt it coming, but it was really a moment of kind of coming to Jesus moment for a lot of people. But of course, this has been not only felt on the Wall Street, it's felt in our built environment as well. We talked about the problem of the skin, the tautness of the skin, and the kind of unrelatedness of what's happening underneath those skin, and also what happens outside of those skins, right? And at some moment, the crash is not only happening in financial systems, but also in kind of lives and lives of people and the life of non-human lives as well. And the problem of the Cartesian grid, the system that really takes over the entire world, is not a new problem. From the moment of early Bauhaus to the 1960s and 70s critique of this continuous monument, and a lot has happened in the last century. So we started to really think about it as a generation of architects. How do we really exist and start a practice that can have some engagement with these realities that we all find ourselves in, financially, materially, system, socially as well. And so, we could return to the drawing, the grid from the individual, or we could think about this grid, puncturing it and getting rid of it and making a mess out of it. Or we can think about really how do we soften this grid and make it elastic and make this system something to really have an effect on the systems and inherent essence of that system itself. So the first project we really used as a way to announce our project was this PS1 competition that we won in 2009, so the year after we started our office. It's called the pole dance. So here you can see that the poles are not the ones that the system is not something that only by human interventions it becomes unstable, it becomes elastic, but it's also inherently fragile and inherently unstable and inherently indeterminable. So it's a very simple installation. It consists of 3 elements. Surf mast base that's kind of casting rubber with the PVC pipes and the beams as the column, and the beams are this bungee cord. So all systems have this elasticity built into it. And we worked with Bio-Happo, asked them to calculate at that point the elasticity of the system, and they said it's uncalculable because the whole point of engineering is trying to take out as much unknown as possible, but you're asking us to do the opposite. So if we have a quantum computer, maybe we can do it. So in the end, what we had to do is to fake this very convincing looking engineer drawing of the stress test and present it to MoMA, but it's completely fake. To show them that, don't worry, the whole forces will resolve itself. But obviously, it's also a moment of playfulness, of not defiance against this reality that we all find ourselves in and not being crushed by it, and still instill some kind of optimism and joy into the practice itself. went down the memory lane and look at a lot of the renderings and videos that we produced, because it was also, as you start your new practice, it's very important to also find your own aesthetic language and representation language. So this was the early animation that we produced, and looking at it, it might not be very impressive to you now, but it was quite, advanced at that moment to make this pose to move and yoga pose to fall from the sky. Anyways, and these images were quite also to kind of find the aesthetic and the effect of something that's indeterminate and something that's not stable. Just how to visualize that was a problem that we very much kind of thought about in representation as well. And so there are a few very, very elemental ingredients, and I already talked about the three. The pizza is the next one that I want to introduce, because it's impossible to construct this system with machines, and you can imagine that none of these individual poles can stand on by themselves, so you have to hold them in place and then string all the beams, and then you add the kind of the mesh together. So we had to buy a lot of pizza for the volunteers to hold them for hours and hours while the whole system goes up, right? So also just kind of thinking about such a simple elemental pushback will create a lot of or pushbacks and troubles that we have to solve. And I think, you're going to talk about the troubles that you ran into with your project, right? Of course, it failed many, many times, and then we had to buy more pizza in order to construct it again. And eventually, after probably 3 or 4 tries, we found the right way to put it all together. And the yoga balls have a really, really important function, because they delay the movement and makes the whole movement not derivative of each other, and it kind of introduce another element of complexity in the whole movement of the system. So it became really, really fun, but it's also an important, I would say, first project to really think about what our role is as architect in the age of 2008. We also, as a young person, you want to go way above and beyond, and with any small project you want to do more and more. So this is also a bunch of other projects that spawned out of that. We made an app, we made a drawing contest, we tried to engage globally, and a lot of graphic design and interactive design that was experimented as part of the project.
Thanks. It's quite odd, isn't it, jumping from one to the other?
Okay. Have to reorient you.
Exactly, I have to reorientate. So we left. Well, actually, as Grace points out, it's funny, isn't it? You forget. Working practices have changed from, I hope anyway, from when I was at Zaha's. It was all before mobile phones with cameras, because otherwise the whole thing would have been filmed every day and there'd be no practice, I suspect. What can I say? We typically, some of us would wait 3 months. Those who did get paid would wait 3 months to get paid. And then even when you did get paid, it was sort of 15% down of what it should be. So some of us devised the idea of, why don't we just have another practice? If we're not going to get paid, we'll work parallel practices. And we set up a firm, worked part-time in other practices. She found out in the end. Was furious about it, but never mind. And we thought, okay, fine. What we'll do is set up exactly the opposite. So instead of one figurehead, literally representing the practice as well as literally the income going into one account, it'll go to all of us. So hence group work. It's a collective, an employee ownership trust, which essentially means the company owns the company. No one individual owns the company. You come in and work for us, work into the company, you're automatically a partner. You leave, you're no longer a partner. We have monthly meetings, we make decisions and so on and so forth. That's the structure of the practice. one of our guests, obviously the most well-known project, and that sort of is emblematic of what we do, is Clerkenwell Close, which is an old medieval site in the centre of London. That the old medieval buildings no longer exist, but the street pattern does. But directly beneath our feet is limestone, the first limestone that was found by Norman invaders. The entire street, dare I say about 70-odd%, is post-war, but in that brick fashion that I showed you earlier, i.e. pretend, hung from a steel or concrete frame. And as we discussed, what does it matter? Well, there are some ethical questions, and we can discuss that later. As soon as you hang a material from a structure, the structure has to get heavier. Typically, if you're hanging brick or something heavy, the structure is getting 30% heavier overall. That's obviously more material. What does that matter? It's more cost for the client, but it's more embodied carbon you're burning. And we ask the question, well, why are we doing that? Why are we still doing that? And of course, there's a long history of that. We can again discuss that later, but if I just suggest Bertiker and Semper had exactly the point of crises in the early 19th century, early to mid 19th century, that we're just drawing. Architecture had already been divorced from understanding our materials, and we're just drawing. Why are we drawing this stuff? How's it held up? And do we care about it? Does it matter? So these things are perennial, and they will remain perennial as long as we're not educated to understand the material properties, structural properties, and so on. So we decided to try and educate ourselves. Why are we building stone on steel and concrete frames as a veneer? Is that the most efficient, cost-effective, greenest way of building? And of course, the answer is no. It turns out we just forgotten how to build in stone. None of us visit quarries. We went to visit a quarry and quickly found out this is how it's dug out. These are the basic methods of cutting, drilling, splitting limestone, within which you find quartz pockets, fossils, and so on. But none of us know that because we tend to see it via salespeople giving us samples of small bits of limestone. I realized, okay, fine. So we understand that it's cost-effective, structurally possible, and the dressing, in other words, what is the contemporary way of using that limestone, can be as it's found in the quarry. How does it work structurally? Well, a reason, I mean, it looks complex, doesn't it? But this is a lot simpler than putting up a steel frame and cladding it. We tested that, and you can sort of see that as a form of an exoskeleton, leaving the interior as what the 1970s termed as loose fit. So there's no columns on the interior. You can do what you like with it over the years, turn it from residential to smaller residential units, hotel, office, and so on. And the interior then is entirely timber. So it's that decisions on what those materials can do, not just for structural purposes and their longevity, but also their cost, and then ultimately their poetic outcomes, specifically mostly at ground floor level, the tactile areas, the things that you touch, the stuff that Edward R. Ford might call the autonomous detail, as opposed to the articulated. Climate. So we're all now more than ever conscious of the impact of the construction industry on climate. So 40%, roughly 40% of annual emissions are due to us in terms of what we specify, how it's built, how it's operated, and then how it's reused / demolished at the end of it. So that's 40%, quite significant. And most of us would say, well, me as an architect, I have such little impact, I have such little agency, especially if I don't understand the nature of those materials. I've done a beautiful drawing, and those other consultants, the structural engineer and everybody else is specifying them. It's them. Well, this is our argument about educating yourself. There is something called the BSRI University of Bath Inventory of Carbon and Energy, which lists all materials typically used in construction. Unfortunately, it lists them as kilograms of carbon per kilogram of material. Not much use to any of us because we don't tend to work in kilograms of material, but we do work in volumes. It's not very difficult to convert mass into volume. We did that for most of the buildings, most of the materials we use in our building, and then actually, instead of alphabetical order, put it in the order of worst and best performing materials, and turned it into a traffic light system, which I found out from our students you don't have here. We have a traffic light system when you go to the supermarket and you fill your trolley full of food that tells you immediately, oh dear, high sugar, high fat, so on and so forth. Red, red. Stop filling your shopping trolley with lots of red stuff. You can, it's great fun, but you're not going to last for very long. So you tend to balance it. So that's what we suggested with this. You can, no one's saying, never use the red, don't buy high-fat cream cakes and all the rest of it, but just don't try and live off them. Mix it up a bit, which is what that's sort of suggesting you do. So what we learnt on Clerkenwell was then applied with that traffic light system on Finchley Road, which is twice the height. Well, instead of where we could replace more concrete and steel, we did with mostly cross-laminated timber and then stone as well. Let me just flick back for a moment, if I can. That one there. So EN 15978 is the global agreed measure of embodied carbon of a building across its lifespan. So section A, which is this bit, I'm just going to have to shout because I'm not near the mic, that bit there, and end of life demolition and reuse is about 57%. So the majority is the materials, its construction, and what you do with those materials at the end of it. Operational is about 43%. This is 2017. Every year, those operational equipment becomes more efficient, which it does. It's more and more important, the materials you choose. Yeah? So your early specification, which is why it's so urgent for you guys to learn about those materials, so you become, ultimately you get agency in the choice of your materials and the outcome, and therefore the embodied carbon. Now imagine if all of us had that thought experiment in that traffic light system of materials, and we all built in timber, 100% timber. You might have noticed, hopefully you have, I'm going to have to flick back again because I might have not made the point clear. Can you see at the bottom, the green has minus on it? That's because timber is carbon sequestrating, so you probably understood from your forestry. The timber is taking in CO2, which is a molecule of 2 oxygen and 1 carbon. Some of you are smiling, but the reason I have to labour this, because I sometimes sit with engineers who've forgotten that timber is carbon sequestrating, that it takes in CO2, breaks up that molecule, throws out the oxygen because it doesn't want it, and takes in the carbon. So only a third of the mass of the CO2 is turned into the mass of the timber. So it needs to eat lots and lots of CO2 to make the equivalent mass in timber, which is why it's CO2 negative. So as long as that timber is cut and used in construction and not burnt or thrown into landfill, it's effectively a CO2 battery. So that CO2 will always remain in the mass of the timber. So the idea is that even after demolition, you make sure that timber is reused. It's called material passporting. It's something that the Dutch sort of innovated with, and slowly across Europe it's spreading. All the materials in your building are identified, and when you want to, even if you want to refurbish, that material has to be taken out, and you're legally bound to make somebody else reuse it elsewhere, and therefore that helps the circular economy, but also makes sure the CO2 is not released back in the atmosphere if you're burning the timber or throwing it into landfill. So that thought experiment, if you make all your buildings 100% timber, everything, then all buildings are carbon sequestrating. But of course you can't. You can't get to your electrics, your plumbing, and so on and so forth out of timber. But if you keep balancing that, your building can still be carbon negative in its materials. The next challenge is operational. Highly challenging in urban situations to get your operational carbon to be carbon negative. But nevertheless, you can try. In Britain, as you probably saw from some of those slides, we're brick obsessed. Brick, brick, brick. Everything's brick all the time at the moment. And brick is one of the worst carbon emitters. Making bricks is one of the worst carbon emitters. We asked the question for some quarries about a year or two ago, can you cut brick stone to brick dimensions, and will it cost about the same as a fired clay brick? Well, of course we can cut it to any dimension. It's just the stuff beneath our feet, isn't it? Cut it to any dimension. How much is a typical brick? And I foolishly answered by saying, oh, well, as architects we'll spend £1.90, £2 a brick. And 2 weeks later they came back and said, yeah, it's a miracle. It's the same price. Oh, God, I'm being a bit dim. So I phoned up another 10, 11 quarries, and they range from 60 pence to £1.50 to £2, yeah. So it turns out that if we specify bricks, stone bricks, instead of fired clay bricks, the same price, but the embodied carbon's about 98 to 99% less, because we're just cutting it, and that's when using diesel equipment, not when using renewable energy to do your cutting. So these things, it's bizarre, isn't it? That people who cut stone for a living, it hadn't occurred to them to even enter the construction sector to sell architects' brick. I would argue that it's us, we're at all ends of that spectrum of construction who have the expertise to connect those dots, as it were. So I'm labouring the point about get yourself educated about materials for all sorts of reasons. So a brick version of that, a brick version that's carbon negative, where the superstructure is CLT and then the brick aims to be as low in its embodied carbon as possible. I'm going to race through these slides because I am labouring the point. Canary Wharf actually asked us to do a study. Can you build a tower in stone just like Clerkenwell Close? We hadn't tried it. With our engineers, sustainability engineers and cost consultants, we found we could. And if you look carefully, on the far end is an all-stone version. So the floor slabs, the columns and walls, everything is stone. Its embodied carbon is a lot less than the steel version, the steel frame, which is second from the right, or a concrete frame version. But the one that's gone negative is where we've then put timber floor slabs in, so the cross-laminated timber floor slabs and internal partitions all in timber. So there is a demonstration that if you're careful about your choice of materials, you can get the same outcome in terms of your building, the building form, whatever illusions you're after, but it's carbon negative. And then look at the cost comparison. And this is 2019. So the stone has actually come down. Can you see there, frame and upper floors? The stone is fairly expensive at 569, much more than the steel and the concrete. But since then, we've been working, and our studio will know, we went to visit some quarries, to get that price down so it becomes the equivalent of concrete at least, or concrete or steel. And this is the first year where that's gonna happen. But the reason it's that much cheaper, if you look at the bottom line, the timber and the stone version is cheaper than the steel or the concrete version, is because ultimately the structure is the finish, internally and externally. You don't go and clad your stone frame with more stone. You don't clad the interior timber and stone with other plasterboard or anything else. Timber and the stone are perfectly good to look at. Obviously, you have to fireproof, and those are other areas. What we find, again, I'm going to race through these because I'm conscious I'm going to end up swallowing too much time, but this isn't our work, but we get asked by, because you begin to develop a layer of expertise or level of expertise, you get asked by significant developers, larger scale developers, what can we do about our master plan? So we suggested, look, at the moment, you're getting BREEAM Platinum, which is the highest possible level for your office buildings. Same with the residential buildings on sustainability. But you're still building exactly as you did 30, 40 years ago. How the hell are you getting BREEAM Platinum? Well, unfortunately, you can tick boxes saying, I have considered using CLT. At some point I dreamt about it in the middle of the night. A terrible nightmare, I had to use CLT. I've ticked the box, and that's good enough. Yeah. Then all my timber doors are actually sustainably sourced. Bang, you've got platinum. It's most of us don't have a choice. We hand this information over to sustainability engineer, and bang, we've got platinum. But the reality is the building's no different, really, from 30, 40 years ago. So if we make the decision we can substitute those materials for stone and timber in a viable, cost-viable way, because ultimately that's what clients are bothered about. They have to borrow money, and we don't want them to spend twice the amount of money, otherwise it wouldn't happen. They'll just revert back to steel and concrete. If they can do it, then why not, in terms of cost? And you can see there, you can see the reduction in the embodied carbon, and where 103% basically means it's now minus in its embodied carbon compared to had it been a steel or concrete frame, and so on and so forth. The more timber you use, the better. So that's entirely where the superstructure is actually glulam and CLT floor plates, and then it's a self-supporting brick skin. So these are examples then we give to those sort of developers as this is everyday architecture. It's not necessarily what we do, but it's everyday architecture, so you can do your master plans and ensure that the entire scheme is carbon negative. That's more of the same, really. Is that you? Yeah.
I'm going to take this a little bit slow because the second stretch of my presentation is still a little bit in the past, but a lot of this is about the conversation, isn't it, with people who make it, and like your stone supplier who didn't even know what the kind of matrix is of the materials that he's been dealing with all his life, and talking with the clients and talking with developers and the urban planners and so on and so forth. So if we want to change anything, conversation is probably the most invisible but most important ingredients in that project. This is maybe a project that when we started to realize that indeed those kind of conversations are the most important ingredients to kind of push the boundaries of an architectural technique and expression. And I had this logo on. I don't know if any of you can recognize this at this point, but it's Alibaba. So this is a project that's also defined. The reason I put all this different apps in the slides is also to remind ourselves that we're very much a product of our time, of the tools and the systems that we're born into. And this project was very much kind of also enabled by Alibaba, which used to be this enabling platform, but now we have obviously come to understand a lot of its problems as well. But this is also a project that we were trying to translate the PS1, which we were working with the structure and thinking about the elasticity of the construction itself. But this is a more kind of translating that into another whole series of elasticities and multiplicities and kind of ambiguities as a language. For example, the Man Ray image of the Enigma of Isidore, where you're playing with what's being wrapped inside the content and the physical reality of the thing versus the perception of the thing itself. In a lot of the Asian paintings, where geographically those paintings and the locations of the plants and woods and the mountains are accurate, so they also act as a map, but as well as expressed the really experience and the spirit of the place. And Alexander von Humboldt, who really took the scientific method and tried to understand the kind of ecological systems all around the world, and it's what makes mountains happen, and what are the different stratas and the different layers of lives that live in it, but also made this beautiful plate of illustrations to understand the kind of the life of this information, as well as published a really beautiful journals and diaries of his kind of lived experience of exploring these mountains. So we were thinking about how this idea of the elasticity and can expand itself, and really to engage more topics and aspect of what architecture is. So this is a project in Seoul, Korea. It's in one of the oldest historical neighborhood across the street from the Imperial Palace. And it's in the recent years, this was 2012 when it's completed, but in the 2014 when it's completed, in 2012 when we started it. And then so in the recent decades, this older neighborhood has been invaded by this larger building mass that are need to really embody much larger programs like contemporary art galleries, and that has been quite contentious in the city. And so we were asked by Kucha Gallery, which was the biggest gallery, contemporary art gallery in Seoul, to create one of their biggest column-free gallery space, the K3, really deep into the historical neighborhood. So we were given the footprint already, and rather than, again, kind of thinking about the dressing up this given gallery box with claddings and kind of paint jobs, to think about how the elemental volumes of the programs, both the gallery as well as accessory programs like vestibule and HVAC box and staircase and so on and so forth, can just be quite matter of fact, exist on the site, so that there is no fluff that make it even consume bigger footprint. But then as well as how to make this quite a diagrammatic and brutal and crude expression into something that's more crafty, and maybe the form is not something that we find in a computer, and it's not something predetermined, but it's really determined by the volumes of the program and the function itself. So we wrapped the entire building with this chainmail mesh, and this model is made out of the stockings. And so when we presented to the client, she just literally lowered her sunglasses and said one word, said, "I like it, please make it," without even asking us the question what it is, right? And so that was the best design meeting we've ever had. But then we are left with the problem of figuring out what it actually is. This is stocking that become an architectural material. So we thought about it really, really hard, and finally this gave us an inspiration that there have been materials like this that has been at least used on the body of the people, that is quite robust, it's protective, it's structural, it has potential to be structural, but it's also pliable and being able to adapt itself to the situations that it finds itself in. So still the challenge is how to scale it up to a building scale, because this is not something that exists on the kind of as an architectural material. So we started to make models, try to, with cardboard rings, to figure out what's its behavior, what is its kind of stretchability in different directions. We worked with the facade engineer, to really test the behavior of the stainless steel rings, the single rings. And this time, this is actually a real engineer map to figure out the stress distribution over the entire surfaces. And then, we understood so much just digitally and informationally what this thing is, but it still doesn't exist in the physical world. We knew that there is a translation that needs to happen between the digital and the informational and the physical. So we bought this really big chainmail mesh, the biggest that you can buy on Alibaba from India, that usually sell belly dancing equipment. They were wondering what we were doing with this big piece of chainmail mesh, but this is 1 to 10 scale model. That was the biggest we could produce with the market. The available materials. So then we knew that we need to find someone in the world that's willing to go down this really crazy journey to make this thing with us. So we found in China, in this town called Anping, 800 kilometers north or southwest of Beijing. It's so deep in the manufacturing realities of this world that even I, coming from China, has never encountered before. It's a city of 2,000 factories that they basically just make kitchenwares and oil refinery mesh for the entire world. There's no school in the city. There's no hospital in the city. There's only one hotel that doubles as a brothel and restaurant that we had to spend a lot of time in. That's the reality of the manufacturing for the whole world, at least in the stainless steel mesh industry. And we found that our very promising mock-up, the first mock-up, was produced by this, this young man who was welding this by himself the whole time. And then I started to talk to the boss of this workshop, and he looked at me like I'm crazy that I said, we sent you the drawing, this is for architecture, we need 500,000 of this within 8 months. And he said, no, you came to the wrong place. And I said, no, if you guys cannot do it, I don't think we can figure out any other place that can do it. You look around, everyone in this town know how to weld, and they know how to deal with metal mesh. So why don't we do it together? So it took us a lot of convincing. And so he got his cousins, his niece together, and probably 5 workshops all got together. And we invented the whole way of scaling up the production of this and quality control, rented the car wash place, shop in town to kind of process the finish of this, and the local schoolyard to make our first big-scale, full-scale mock-up. And the kids were our inspectors. And in the meantime, the concrete structure was going up in Korea, so the whole box and everything is just a really simple concrete volume, which is the primary predominant way of building things in Korea. And then we got a lot of the stainless steel mesh arrived on site 8 months after we arrived in Anping. And it was one of the coldest days in Korea, so you can see that if you didn't wear gloves, the hand skin would actually be stuck to this metal mesh. So the whole construction, again, means in the method, we had to invent the whole way of even installing this. This time we didn't need to buy pizza, we just got a crane and stretched this mesh from the top, and then there's all these springs around the perimeters that you can tension it afterwards, after the mesh were anchored and secured at the bottom, and then you tension it at the top, so the entire skin becomes one garment, basically, that is welded on site. There's 16 of these panels that's hand welded on site, but because the way you weld on site would be the same way as you weld off site, so at the end of the day it becomes a seamless one piece of garment wrapped around this entire gallery space that created this in-between space between the kind of functional programmatic concrete volumes and the exterior kind of expression. And there's a handmade quality to this that had a really great dialogue with the Hanok homes, these traditional homes around the neighborhood.
That's rather beautiful. Right, I've got to get my mind around it. Okay, future. Someone's tied this is right. What's this? This is different uses of stone. So there's an Italian government essentially paid for some research. Still a big stone industry in Italy. Vast amount of it is waste as a result of cutting stone into smaller slithers. You get a lot of waste from there, and it's currently in sort of mountainous piles. What can you do with them? So essentially you can make terrazzo. The long and short of it is you can make a sort of form of terrazzo. However, if you're going to put that together, and the expectation was you just make tiles out of it and you sell it as flat tiles, but if you're actually putting it back together with an agent, essentially a glue, well, why not put it across a piece of formwork so by the time it does set, it becomes self-supporting, so it becomes a piece of structure. So our first attempts, so keep an eye that this is 2 layers inside and outside, and then insulation in between. So it's external finish, internal finish, and insulation in between. I think this actually went to Korea. Unfortunately, COVID meant that we couldn't go and visit it. And then it couldn't come back, so it was destroyed. But our first attempt went to Venice, which was just a single layer. So this shows you that put it across a piece of formwork and it's self-supporting. It could be its own roof structure, its wall structure, and so on and so forth. Simple stacking. So just taking blocks and stacking them. So the least amount of work you need to do, the least amount of energy you need to spend. And then beginning to experiment with pre-tension. So what you see is rods that are pierced through the stone, and either side, it's basically a shish kebab of stone, tightened up to become, initially we were being a bit dim. We thought, we can make a lovely beam out of this. Then it occurred to us, if we turn it through 90 degrees, it's a floor plate. So you can replace all your precast concrete floors or even metal deck with concrete on top with pre-tension stone. So it's still, there's metal in it. Remember, we're not saying we're eliminating cream cakes and bacon. It's just about reducing it in the diet. So it's pre-tension floor plates, beams. Some of them are sort of 18 meters long. And mixing that technology. The next one was those lovely medieval arches that we look at. And took a vast amount of temporary works. Can we do a contemporary version of that? This is actually built now. I think there might be a slide of it. But we started off with our structural engineer, instead of using a bit of software, taking balloons and just playing with bits of string to see how what are effectively what become rib arches then behave with the sort of the bulbous areas are their vaults. And that's where that previous technology came into to sort of applied reality. They became these pre-formed vaults that fill in between the rib arches. That's it on site. It's actually finished now. So it looks slightly chaotic. These are all made in a yard, transported in and dropped into place. So you can see there on the far left one of the pre-formed vaults being dropped into place. Oh, that's it. Yeah, so someone's put a slide in of the sort of finished thing. We were asked to look at a footbridge, and this is where the stone becomes slightly a bit of a fetish. You know, we were asked to look at a foot and cycle bridge, and you're thinking, well, it's a 90-meter span with 60 meters in the center of it. Is that right? 60, and then I think it was 15 either side, something like that anyway. Could we do it all in timber? The answer was probably not. Can you do it in stone? Yes, if you pre-tension it. And if you look at, again, on the left-hand side, you can see one where it's essentially a U-beam. You have a U-beam structure in stone, but then clearly you don't need all that stone. In some areas there's more stresses than others, so you can remove some of that. And if you take it to its natural conclusion, it's effectively a truss. So we thought, well, let's take it to its natural conclusion and see what happens as a truss. It is a bit brutal. I mean, this is in Graz in Vienna. The burghers of Graz said, a stone bridge? Why is it not steel? Who builds bridges in stone? And you have to sort of scratch your head and point at the bridges that exist in the town. The last few hundred years, it's all stone. Nevertheless, it was a bit of a challenge for them. And it's got a sort of, a bend in it, which we found sort of surprised us. I'm going to take you through a number of. This makes it sound like we just do stone. Not sure why it's all stone. A reuse project, so where you're reusing parts of a series of warehouses to create this library in Milan, not to be built, unfortunately. So it's partly this idea of spolia. So if you look carefully, there's found bits of stone as well as new stone, found bits of metal from the warehouses that are being demolished. So we're all interested in reuse now. the ancients, the Greek and Roman ancients, would have called it spolia. Whatever stone we find from ancient temples and so on, castles, we reuse for our contemporary purposes. Here's a non-stone version, non-stone scheme. This is a site in central London that was bombed and stayed empty for until about 5 years ago. Our client bought it, held a competition. He's very brutal, and said, "Look, I for 2 weeks I want you to come up with some ideas. I've hired Liebeskind. You won't know. Well, hopefully some of you know Tony Fredden. So it's complete opposite ends of the spectrum, and yourselves." That's nice. And yourselves. I'm not sure what that means, but thank you. You got 2 weeks to come up with an idea. God, this is absurd. But anyway, we had a go. Notice how it's the sort of weak version of a Palladian villa with a central piece, a wing, and one of the sort of end pavilions that was bombed out. And really, the terraced shops and the shop owners would have lived above. And we thought, well, why don't we suggest to him we're just going to rebuild what was there, a sort of pseudo-authentic reconstruction. And we'd been thinking about this because in London and certain conservation areas specifically, there's a real motivation to try and rebuild as we had in the past because modernism's failed, so on and so forth. It's an interesting discussion on nostalgia. We all have it. I think wherever we are on the planet and whatever age we're at, we have a sort of suspicion that something in the past might have been better. And it's obviously a stripping back, isn't it? A stripping back of narrative where, like monument building, you idealize something, you put it on a pedestal, it's an ideal, but it's actually an editing of that reality, of creating a new narrative. And it's that question of who is in control of that narrative. And we realized if we suggest that we're rebuilding what was on site, clearly we're not going to you can't actually rebuild, you can't meet all the modern regulations in the way we built in the past. It's not going to be an authentic reconstruction, but let's just talk about the idea of why we have those motivations and why does that building not take on that argument. So this is a casting. It's a cast monument of that past, of that Victorian past, the idealization that Victorian past is fantastic and we all need to rebuild that. That's what our councils are telling us, rebuild please. And we explain to them, we're going to choose a material that is in situ, it's poured on site. The nature of that material itself will have flaws. And then the new inhabitation will begin to re-edit that, as it were. What does that mean? So ultimately it means you're creating a sort of terracotta concrete mixture that you're pouring in situ on site in day pours. You have to create formwork for it. I won't tell you the long story of how we got there, how we convinced our client to do it, but it turned out to be viable and possible, and he was happy with it. Contractors are highly concerned because they're convinced that architects want perfection, and we explain to them, look, the formwork on the outside and the inside is going to be flawed in its own way. We're going to take a point cloud survey of the pavilion on the other side of the terrace. We're going to flip it in CAD, and then we're slowly going to break that up into day pours, and we're going to turn that from a CAD model into a routing model. So the routing tool, just translating it from a CAD model to a routing model, is already going to have its errors. The routing tool will have it's a fairly cheap routing tool. We could get a smaller one, which would be double the time and therefore double the cost. So it's of today's cost, will have its flaws as it routes away. And then when you begin to pour this material in, it will have its flaws. Please do not try to correct those flaws. If you look carefully, there are two walls, insulation between, they're tied together. It is the superstructure, and then there's CLT and everything else is timber. So the flaws are intended, and the contractor didn't believe us and kept on trying to repair them. So we just let him do that. So ultimately, it is the idea of this flawed narrative of monuments. I mean, if any of you are German, the German for monument is Denkmal, which is far better way of thinking of monuments. Think upon me, look upon me and think. And that all monuments are ultimately flawed. I'll race through this. Apparently, I've got a minute. Oops. Yeah, this was one more project. I think this is a more recent one. One of our students is looking at something similar. Where is he? Michael? Is he here? He'll be told off now for not being here. One facade is, we're done. Anyway, stone and timber. I think that's it. Oh no, there you go. I'm finishing on this. Maxi. So I started off on Maxi, which is a project I worked on at Zaha's. This is a competition for Maxi where we started off the idea with a Sylvia Plath poem on the moon, on unrequited love, and somebody taking all the attention for a research facility that's part of the museum. So this journey from that relationship between the two into the research facility. Oh, there you go. That's the end of it.
Do you want me to still do? Okay. I'll race through it as well. All right. Let me see. I say one word per slide. ChatGPT, context collapse. Charles Moore campus region. A project that has to engage with a whole complex dialogue and conversations and the complex kind of social construct in the middle of the woods in the Berkshires, but none of this timber has been used in the last, I would say, 50 years. And so we looked at different ways of constructing the site and constructing the kind of the volume on the site. But ultimately, this whole design process, as you would go, when you go into the profession, you will know that it gets pushed through an entire slew of conversations, stakeholder engagement, workshops, and so on and so forth. And often you get thousands of feedbacks from all different people, and then somehow the architecture has to synthesize all this feedback. So ChatGPT is actually quite useful if you have over 1,000 feedback from many, many different people to understand what you're dealing with even. Anyways, and ultimately they get pushed through and this process, and it becomes something that really distills the essence of the project. In this case, it's a museum for the Williams College. It's the first purpose-built museum after Charles Moore's expansion. With all the, we decided to actually push all the gallery in the back, and in the front is all the pedagogical education programs like the research center, classrooms, and auditorium. So it's a museum, but it's really kind of museum disguised as a student center that's enveloped under this big like pliable, soft, big roof that I will talk about. But this roof also has a whole porch wrapped around it, so there is not really, it's not the wall that greets you, it's really the kind of the big roof that greets you. And this entire roof is actually the main structure of the building is made out of mass timber. We're quite promiscuous with materials, so whatever makes sense for the project, we try to take that and push as far as we can. So this one, the roof, it has a quite articulated form to really also be in dialogue with its surroundings, this kind of rolling hills of the Berkshires, as well as producing different ceiling height within the building, because there are different programs and gallery sizes that needs different ceiling height. So it's a negotiation between the inside and outside, and how to do that without it becoming, again, cladding and structure and in the scheme being separate from each other with mass timber. We pushed for LBC core for this building instead of lead or BRIM or any other ones, because indeed that a lot of the sustainability kind of thinking is just ticking off the box, and we feel that the LBC core at this moment is the most holistic way of balancing embodied and operational, as well as kind of the human-centric wellness, as well as just kind of how you deal with the site together. So this project is all mass timber in its main structure, and the masonry is self-supporting. And the mass timber itself creates a warp on itself. So if you think about this feedback loop between the material behavior, and that it runs through our entire project, and the form finding as this back and forth loop, what we did is to study with this large span CLT, if you just support it on one corner, how the flat surface would by its own self weight start to deform. And rather than having the structure to counter that deformation, we work with that deformation to create this rolling surfaces that's able to accommodate the different ceiling height of the building. So embodied carbon, we did a lot of that studies and really pushed the university the college to adopt this in this moment, a slightly 20% more expensive structural scheme, but it's, hopefully this building will stand for another 100 years, and that would all pay off over time, as well as one interesting discussion here is that the museum operationally has a really, really demanding climate control requirement as a typology. So we have been pushing the museum to think about that if you can just lower the requirement of the 50% humidity and 21 degree constant climate requirement to just being a little bit more flexible, so you have plus or minus 5% of the humidity range with plus or minus 3 or 4 degrees of temperature variations throughout the years, we're able to save already 60% of the operational energy in the building. And most of the mediums in the art, like stone sculptures, oil paintings, they could care less. So this is just to say that there's a lot of system that we need to understand. We need to gain literacy and have that conversation with all these different layers of our societies and our practice, and really try to push this system to be more forgiving and more accommodating.
Thank you. I think we have some time for questions, and I know that there are many. It's always striking me, sometimes when we put together these pairings for the position series, we never know how they're going to quite turn out, and I'm always really amazed and interested to see how many fascinating intersections we could find between two people who don't know one another. You didn't know one another, and you didn't know you would be paired together. So this is really fascinating. It strikes me that both practices began at a moment when you were thinking, and also coming from very different places. Like in some ways, when I think, Amin, about the fact that you were working with Zaha Hadid, there's almost no architect who somehow symbolizes a kind of luxury way of working, and so coming in a way top down, and then Jing, the practice kind of growing from bottom up, and yet arriving at a very similar spot, which is to question the fragility of the world, the questions of our ecology, deep questions of sustainability, and then positioning all of that in terms of the ways in which you're controlling material processes and building systems. So here you are again, I think coming from two very different backgrounds, and yet finding in your practices, in the voice of your own practices, and a really essential way of working and a scrappiness to me that I think is in both of your practices. I mean, you're both exuding this kind of willingness to test material processes and to question the ways in which one does it. Now, it's interesting because in Amin's it feels like you are really doing a kind of meditation on stone, and that's a really big question. And trying to get that knowledge, the vertical knowledge in that. And then in Jing, your practice looking at, whatever, whether it's ChatGPT or whatever you might find, Alibaba, this kind of resourcefulness in a different way, maybe integrating some interesting technologies. Again, I would just find that fascinating. Maybe you can talk about that because, again, I know you didn't know one another before this, so I think it's interesting where the points are that you are together and where you deviate.
Yeah, I guess looking, I mean, I was very much aware of your practice because when the stone facade came out, I was like, wow, you know, there are other people who are also as crazy as us, just pushing the materials to do something that we are not used to seeing them do anymore. So I think that's really something that I think we share at the kind of the core of our practice. You know, we come more from a tension point of view. You know, a lot of our projects are dealing with tensions, and we started to work with compressions recently with more masonry and materials. But I think kind of you're really digging into the kind of a compression and right. Maybe that's where it deviates, and I think maybe another. Grace, as you were talking about our two practices, I was thinking that we both intuitively feel that there is a lot of abundance in the world that we have found ourselves in. There's abundance of tools, abundance of materials, abundance of laborers, right? Abundance of market. Those are the realities that we grew up in, but there is also a huge, that comes with the abundance, a huge amount of waste. And maybe that's where the scrappiness comes from. You know, we're trying to find this waste in the world, the physical reality and the lived reality of our world, and try to take that out of it. You know, because we can't continue to produce this waste and be complacent with this abundance that's just not sustainable, right? So, you know, not waste the materials and not waste the technologies and informations that we have, but really take a close look at it, a critical look at it, and how much efficiencies and how much waste, you know, just non-purposeful waste that we can take out of it. That's probably the pursuit that we share.
Scrappiness and abundance of knowledge, I think we definitely share. I think the difference between us and perhaps our old bosses, a generation before, might be that if you look at the Norman Fosters and even the Zahas, the way the building ultimately had to perform was contingent on a sort of perfection, the seamless details. And I think we're not aiming for perfection, which can never be reached. They're always flawed or fake perfections, where actually everything behind that surface perfection is often bodged bits of timber and other stuff packed in behind to get that surface to meet perfectly. And that scrappiness for us, I suspect, I can see from when you're visiting, people actually make the stuff. So instead of imagining perfection and letting somebody else deal with trying to reach it, you're doing the same as we do. We go and meet those people who make it and tell us, well, this is the result. Mm-hmm. If you want it to work, this is how I put it together, and you don't need anything else. Mm-hmm. There's a scrappiness in that sort of a sort of delight in that scrappiness of process of meeting people. And, yeah. And
I think we didn't mention that that Florian, for your practice, Jing, you know, had worked with Sana. So I also see that you are both thinking, whether consciously or not, you know, you're asking rather Freudian questions of your origin story. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, no, I think you're totally right.
Sorry, but you know, I mean, don't you think? Because actually, like, think about that, like from Zaha to Sana to and maybe others in the past, in one's past CV, and I think that's really interesting because you're not less demanding of what you're trying to do with the work in some ways, but you are really going at it in a completely different way that is a kind of critique of your heritage, isn't it not?
I think one always critique one's parents, right?
I think you're entirely correct. It's Freudian.
The mother is always to blame.
Probably for good reason. I mean, in architecture, especially. I mean, we're the ones who are at the coalface having to draw it all and realizing, well, this is nuts. Why are we doing these endless drawings for stuff that could be done a lot simpler? And then, obviously striving for that simplicity.
We don't have so much time, so I'd love to open it to the floor immediately because I could go on here. I'm so fascinated, but I'm sure you all have questions.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Which is the continuation of your last question. What would you critique of us?
Ooh. So it's. I have one thought, because see, Florian was on our faculty, so we actually had a lot of chances to engage with some of the work that you were doing, because I think Florian was teaching Core 4, among other studios, but for many years. In fact, many of the early years that I was here at the GSD, he was here. So interestingly, when the Korean project came out, I was wondering what the motivation was to wrap what is a relatively conventional shape, but to then give it another form. And I had a lot of questions about why one would take approach of building the building and then building the veil, and going through so much challenge to do that when in fact one could build the building once. So there was a question about that in my mind. But what's interesting is that the outcome then was so unexpected. This kind of otherworldly, very ephemeral form, that I realized that it was touching at a very sensual condition that I think was very unexpected. And then Amin, when I visited your office this past summer in London, I was so surprised because I'd seen images of the project, but then there in person was really surprised at how deeply just tactile the experience was, and the quality of the materials and the types of space. So I think that there's something else that we probably don't get as much through the photographs. That was very surprising to me. That I couldn't really see in those images. So.
Well, I was alluding a little bit in the intro that why would Man Ray wrap, the sewing machine and the table with a cloth, right? Why would Alexander von Humboldt write a journal and a diary and make those plate while, if it's just a scientific expeditions and explorations? And why would we make a beautiful ink painting where the idea is to communicate where you should go, in space? I think there is always something more that we try to make beyond the functional, right?
Thank you, Amin and Jing. I had a question about 168, the project at the corner of the townhomes. Yeah. So this is like very recent, like research, literally Google. But I recently came across an article from Vox talking about community design standards and restrictions for facade alterations, and how a lot of the people who are doing renovations in their residential projects are looking to build down instead of renovate out. I kind of wanted to understand what the negotiation process was when you were doing this new construction that was ultimately imitating the existing structures that were on the block for your project, because it's a negotiation between the contemporary and the traditional of the London landscape. So
yeah, I mean, there's two answers there. The reason that people are going down is because often you're stopped from going up any higher. You can go in the roof, perhaps. You might be allowed to, but you can't get much higher. And it's the value of land, or value of property, once it's actually built, is 3 times what it is to build. It's even if you're going down. So some people used to go down as far as you like, infinitely, all the way to the core of the earth. You'd go down 6 stories, but you'd be so long on site the boroughs basically got together and said, right, we've had enough of this. You're going down. Everyone's allowed to go down maximum of 1 story. They haven't stipulated how deep that story is. So some stories are like 5 stories, with pretending it's one giant story and then putting intermediate floors in between. That's why they're going down. In terms of building new, I know you guys, I mean, over here, it's zoned, and I think it's not really, the aesthetics aren't that key. It's all aesthetics. It's all entirely. There's just. It was never meant to be that way, but by default of leaving planning officers, design officers, councillors, the final decision, not on a sort of factual facts and figures of square meterage use classes, but on the aesthetics. Inevitably now it comes down to taste. So a lot of those projects, there's a sort of stream vein of our work, which is a critique of that. So it's the idea that, why do we look at the past and find that more pleasing? And because it's stripped down, we edit it and sometimes, dare I say, mock those arguments. So there's another scheme we finished not long ago, a couple of months ago, which is a mesh. A stiff mesh, where from a distance you approach, as you're walking down the street, it looks like, established brown stone, big scheme, in a peripheral vision part of that landscape. And as you get closer, you realize daylight's falling through all the cornices and detailing of the building. You get closer still and realize the columns aren't even hitting the ground. They're suspended above the ground by, not much, but they're suspended. And you get closer still and you realize it's tin thin. It's 1.5 millimeters of metal. It's the illusion then that you realize this sense of permanency, the established narratives of the past are an illusion and can melt into air, which some design conservation officers and councillors think, you're just rebuilding the past, fantastic, great. But despite the fact you've given them that argument, so those two things can carry. They can carry, their vehicle for that project, which is entertaining to us because we're then playing with it. And not a lot of people know Palazzo del Te. So Palazzo del, D-E-L, Te is T-E, which is a 16th century villa in Italy. So imagine by this stage, the Italian Renaissance is several generations old, but Giulio Romano, its architect, had taken possession, ownership of the classical language and was now playing with it. So there are pediments that are broken. Those pediments that you see broken by Stirling, for instance, Giulio Romano was doing exactly the same thing, and Stirling's sort of referencing those. Pediments that are broken, things that are upside down and missing. And it's the idea that the classical language is his, but he's also playing with it. He and his client are playing with it, changing the sort of narrative, the established narrative. It's interesting that, sorry, this is a drawn-out answer, but it's interesting that Inigo Jones, so in England, the classical language is not yet entered. Inigo Jones, as a young apprentice, has been sent already on one grand tour, simply to look at the classical language for theatre design and costumes. He's sent on his second grand tour specifically to look at architecture, to bring back the authentic classical language to England. And he looks at Palladio's work and he looks at Giulio Romano, and it's Palladio he brings back to England, not Giulio Romano. So Giulio Romano by this stage is what we might describe as sort of mannerist, almost Baroque, and clearly undermining the whole idea of the classical language. And it's too much for Inigo Jones. He realizes that England's not ready for it. And eventually England's never ready for it because the neoclassical, the sort of Palladian, just runs through to the English work to this day. And yes, we do have aberrations. Sorry, it's turned into history.
No, I think this is interesting, partly because it maybe touches upon why the Clerkenwell Close building is still so riveting, because it's actually very authentic to its origin and to its interests, and produces a kind of aesthetic and compositional character that is not trying to be something else. So, I mean, when we talk about like what we would critique of the the interesting practices. I mean, I find the townhouse, the project to be the one that's the most challenging. It seems actually inconsistent relative to the other interests. And again, not to be critical, but I find that's what I would. We don't have enough time to go into that, but I do find that's fascinating set of subjects because I also see through the work that you're doing the questions of how you scale up in your practice, how you take these material interests, these concerns, and shift scales and program type. I think is beginning to push the practices perhaps out of a certain kind of comfort zone, partly because you might lose control over that. So, I think every practice is concerned about whether it can stay on track when it grows. So maybe that's one of the things that you're thinking about.
Well, how
Are you worried about
even
losing
how
control?
you stay alive when it doesn't
You
grow,
stay alive.
right? Yeah. I think that's probably the more apt questions. It's not even about growth; it's just about that
Staying
balance
alive,
of not implode, right? So, yeah. I think definitely, and I mean, like the project like this, for example, the amount of negotiation that we need to have, with so many different institutional voices to stay on track of the things that you want to push them to think about. It's very difficult, At the end, the stakeholder meeting number 251, you wonder, this is the moment maybe I just give up or not, right?
Well, that says something about EQ that we don't talk enough about in architecture school. Anyway, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Well done.